very good. Well, welcome everyone to Ridgely Christian Church. I'm Russ Boyd. I'm the senior minister here, and we're so glad to have Brandan Robertson here with us.
Thank you.
On your book tour. So thank you.
So excited to be here. Thanks for
Thank
having
you
me.
for coming to Fort Worth. And anybody who's joining us on the live stream or who is watching this later recorded, then glad that you're a part of this too. So thank you for joining us virtually. Just to tell you a little bit about where you are, if you've never been to Ridgely before. So our church is a church of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. We have been here on the west side of Fort Worth since 1955. I have been the senior minister here for a little over 8 years and have found this to be a wonderful and welcoming and sometimes weird place to be and to be in ministry. But some of the things that I love about this congregation that are really important to us are that we have huge garden ministries, which you probably saw driving in. We have a community garden with plots available that are church members and people in the neighborhood who grow food and donate some of that to local nonprofits. And behind the church, if you didn't see it on your way in, be sure to drive behind where we have the Ridgely Giving Garden. And everything that is grown there is donated to West Aid and LVT Rise and other places that feed our neighbors. And we have garden managers on staff and volunteer groups twice a week. So if you ever want to come out and get your hands dirty and help feed our neighbors, just sign up through the Tarrant Area Food Bank website and you can come out and volunteer there. Some other things that are important to us, we are very involved in Room in the Inn. So we help, along with other churches here in Fort Worth, house our homeless neighbors in the summer and in the winter. And here at Ridgely, we partner with 2 Catholic churches to do that. So that is an ecumenical effort, and we've made a lot of great friends at a couple of Catholic churches here in Fort Worth doing that. We take the arts very seriously here, and many of you met Molly Donahue Wilkerson, who was our artist in residence. She recently became a commissioned minister and is now our minister of creative spirituality. And you'll see a lot of Molly's art out here. If you haven't seen it, be sure to wander around and see that. And a lot of that is also art that Molly facilitated by our congregation, by our youth group, by groups who come here on service learning trips with Be the Neighbor and spend a week here in Fort Worth and stay at our church. So be sure to check that out. And then the reason many of you are likely here tonight is we have several years ago finished the process to become an open and affirming disciples church. That was not new that we were that, but it was new that we were officially and publicly that. We, for over a decade, have had queer staff members, church members, lay leaders, so that has been part of who we are. But I'm very glad that our congregation wanted to take the step of going through a several-year process of discernment to say, here is definitely who we are, and to work with Alliance Q, which is the Disciples of Christ LGBTQ plus advocacy organization, has been since the late 1970s, if you can believe that's how long our denomination has had an advocacy group, formerly called GLAD, that was part of our denomination. So that it's not just us saying it, it's someone outside of us saying, yes, they have done the work, and who they're saying they are is who they are, and this is a safe place for queer folks. So we recently, since then, in the last couple of years, have been trying to be more public and figure out what does that look like to tell more people that. And so this was our first time at Pride a couple weeks ago, and we were glad to be there and saw a lot of y'all there at Pride. And then the next thing that I'm so glad it was like 2 weeks after Pride is to be hosting you, so we could be promoting that a couple weeks ago. So
thank you.
So thank you all for coming out here and being here at Ridgely Christian Church. If you know someone who's looking for a church home and any of that sounded like something they would like or you would like, love to talk to you more about it. But also, there's lots of great affirming churches here in Fort Worth. So if that's not the right one, there's a lot of other ones that may be, and I'm happy to point you to them as well. And I know a lot of our friends from Galileo Church are here tonight, and that's another great disciples congregation here that we're glad are here with us. So, but you're not here to hear all that. You're here to hear Brandan. And so I'm going to read Brandan's official bio so that you know exactly who you're hearing from tonight. Reverend Brandan Robertson is a noted author, activist, and public theologian dedicated to exploring the intersections of spirituality, sexuality, and social justice. He serves as the pastor of Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York City and is the founder and executive director of the Devout Foundation. He is known to many as the TikTok pastor, and his inclusive theological content reaches over 300,000 followers and has garnered 6 million views. He has authored 23 books, including the Indies Book of the Year finalist True Inclusion, which was a book I consulted when we were doing a sermon series at the end of our O&A process. And so I appreciate that book very much. His work has been featured in Time Magazine, CNN, The Washington Post, and he is a sought-after speaker who regularly presents at prestigious platforms like the White House, Oxford University. What's that?
The other White House,
yeah.
to be clear.
Same house, different resident, I'm guessing, yeah. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Pastoral Ministry and Biblical Studies from Moody Bible Institute, a Master of Theological Studies from Iliff School of Theology in Denver, and a Master of Arts in Political Science and Public Administration from Eastern Illinois, and he is pursuing his PhD in Biblical Studies at Drew University. So he is resident of New York City, and we're glad you made the trip here to New York.
Thank you so much. And
from what I gathered from looking at your tour dates, you're making 2 stops in the Metroplex, and one is Cathedral of Hope.
Well, so actually, Cathedral was last weekend, and I got sick, so I had to cancel that one. But last night I got to be in Dallas at a wonderful progressive bookstore.
Oh, good.
Tonight, so yes.
Very good. Well, we are glad to have you here, so welcome.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. It's so good to be here.
And the way that this will work tonight, so we're going to have some conversation, and I'll have some questions for Brandan to kind of let him tell us some of the things that he wants to tell us about, especially with what inspired him to write this book and some of the lessons from it. But we'll also take time for Q&A. So as you're listening, if there are things you are hearing and thinking that you want to ask, hang on to those questions, and we'll take some time so y'all can ask some questions as well. But the first thing I wanted to start with is, why did you feel like this was the right time to write this particular book when you've written so many books already?
Totally.
What led to this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually didn't want to write this book. Some folks might know, I've written at least 2 other, maybe 3, depending on how you count, books on LGBT inclusion. And I figured I said everything that I could possibly say. But my publisher reached out and basically said, this TikTok thing has happened in the past few years since the pandemic. There's a new generation asking these questions. Could you write something geared towards them? And so I started writing this book a little begrudgingly, trying to figure out how to say all of this for a TikTok audience, whatever that means. And what I actually found out as I was writing was that this was a very important book for me. Because in the past decade of doing this work, my own perspective on this topic has changed dramatically. 10 years ago, when I was writing and doing this ministry, I was trying to help people reinterpret 6 Bible verses so that they could fit into a traditional Christian church, and that was the end of it. 10 years later, after pastoring queer folks, after having my own journey and doing life with queer people, I've come to realize that my goal isn't to help us fit into traditional Christianity anymore. Because what I realized is that it's not 6 Bible verses that was ever the problem. It's the entire structure of so-called conservative, orthodox, evangelical Christianity. From the ground up, the way that we talk about the Bible, about God, about who we are as people, all of that leads to not just homophobic and transphobic theology, but all sorts of other terrible versions of toxic theology that I think created a lot of what we're experiencing in our country right now. And so this book became a journey for me to re-articulate what it means for me to be a Christian. And it's kind of a misnomer, because you would think by the title it's just about reconciling queerness and Christianity. But what it actually became was an invitation for all people, straight and queer alike, to be queered, to understand that the call of the gospel is to resist conformity, to resist the systems and structures that force us to be who we're not, to put on masks to be accepted. And this goes to the heart of our faith, right? Paul says, be not conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so this book really ended up, I sum it up with a great quote by the actor Lorenz Tate in the final chapter. And he writes, never beg for a seat at a table when you can build your own damn table. And that's what this book has become for me, an invitation and a spotlight on all the communities, both within traditional Christian churches, but also those outside and on the edges of the church that are creating spaces for queer people and all people to follow Jesus in the truly subversive and, dare I say, queer way that Jesus demonstrated the gospel. Yeah.
One of the words that you use in the title and throughout the book is queer, which is a word that, because of who's around me, I'm used to using now, and is something a lot of my friends and LGBTQ plus colleagues and others use
But I realized and remembered as I was reading your book, you talk about going to England and using that word in a small town, and everyone is immediately horrified because it's not a word that they're used to using in that way. So could you talk a little bit about why you selected that word and sort of reclaimed that word?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, part of the joy of my life is some of my best friends are 60, 70-year-old queer people. And right when I started writing this book and talking about queer and Christian, a lot of them said, I will never use that word. That word was used against me. I do not feel comfortable with it. I'm gay, I am lesbian, that is it. And I think that's valid and legitimate. This book is not telling people you need to identify as queer. But in the opening chapter, I quote Bell Hooks, who defines being queer as not so much who you're having sex with, but being at odds with everything and everyone around you and having to create new ways to thrive and to live. Again, as I said in my opening question, I think that is the invitation of the gospel. The gospel is, I mean, from the earliest Jesus movement, is resistant to both religious and political structures that are trying to force people to obey and to become what they are not in order to gain political capital or social status. And so for me, using the word queer was less about the umbrella usage, which I do use for my own sexuality and it's used for gender identity as well, but more as that overarching theme of queerness as an invitation of the gospel to challenge the status quo. And I think this is also important in institutional churches. And you're going to hear me say lots of things tonight, but let me just say again, I'm a pastor of a very traditional institutional church. I think there's a lot our communities can do. And I do think it's high time, especially for our progressive faith communities, to think about what it means to queer our tradition, to queer what ministry looks like. And again, that does not just mean make it more gay or lesbian or bisexual or trans. It means to move it beyond the arbitrary structures that so many of us grew up in Christianity, believing we needed to submit to in order to be truly Christian. One thing that, and this is the last thing I'll say, and it's kind of a soapbox, so forgive me.
It's your event, Brandon, so
Well,
I
thank
think
you.
pretty much they're
That's
here to
right.
hear you get on your soapbox.
Well, I end the book with a chapter called Our Queer Destabilizing God. And it really becomes kind of the bigger project that I've started to work on in my own life and ministry, which is this idea of orthodoxies and tradition, I think are important and good things. But I also see so many of us in progressive spaces feeling constrained by that. And the questions I want to raise is like, our traditions and our orthodoxies are all fallible human beings getting together in councils under the authority of the Roman Empire, deciding what it means to be Christian. And if you disagreed, you were imprisoned or killed. That doesn't sound like the queer, resistant, subversive Jesus movement that our faith emerged from. And so I do think part of my broader project beyond this book, I've started working on the next one, which has nothing to do with LGBT things, but is around this conversation of what does it look like to be willing to fully deconstruct our Christianity and then begin to reconstruct something beyond the traditional boundaries and borders of what it means to be Christian. And I do want to give a shout out. The Keshet group that's here is advertising a great documentary by my dear friend Amikai called Sabbath Queen. Rabbi Amikai has this incredible Jewish community in New York City called Lab Shul. And it is one of the places that showed me what queered faith could look like. Lab Shul on a high holy day will have about 7,000 young Jews gather together in a nightclub, and they play with their tradition in a way that's deeply reverent to it and deeply acknowledges it, but is also breaking open all the things that traditionally have kept not just LGBT people, but all sorts of people out. And it was one of the things in a period of my own life that brought me back to my Christian faith, was getting to stand in a community that was truly willing to say there are no rules for how we live out our faith. They really believe in the spirit that Jesus describes in John chapter 3 as the wind. Jesus says no one knows from where it comes or where it goes. The spirit cannot be contained. And that is what we believe in as Christians, the living and active spirit of Christ. And that's a queered spirit. And so all of that's simply to say, This idea of using the word queer is both an invitation to people that are LGBT to reclaim Christianity, but also a provocation for everyone else in Christianity to think of how we can break open our tradition in ways that could reach more people and also heal the world.
One of the things I enjoyed about the book is, in addition to just the quote-unquote clobber text that people expect to be dealt with in a book on LGBTQ Christianity, you look at a lot of other stories people don't expect to find associate with queer or queering scripture.
Yeah.
Is there a particular favorite one of those you'd like to kind of share or highlight?
Yeah, I mean, so again, a decade ago, I used to be one of the gay Christians that would have rolled my eyes when someone said, you know, David and Jonathan were gay, right? And my view back then was, that's just some crazy liberal rereading into an ancient text that's not real. And then I started doing graduate level biblical studies. And I started reading the Jewish tradition and the midrash of the rabbis about so many of the Hebrew Bible saints that we know and love. And there are a plethora of people in the Bible that transgressed cultural assumptions, religious assumptions of gender and sexuality in their day. And one of the things I often hear from conservative Christians is, okay, so you can explain away the 6 clobber passages, but there's nowhere in the Bible that affirms LGBT people. And that's actually just not true, historically. From a biblical, critical lens, these folks in Scripture, like David and Jonathan, like Ruth and Naomi, like Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, which is actually a woman's garment, or Simeon, the Ethiopian eunuch, the first person baptized into the church in the book of Acts. All of these people, when looked at a cultural lens of the time period that they were from, would fit under the label of how we use queer in the modern world. They transgressed their gender and cultural norms of their religion and society. They were considered unclean. If you read the rabbinic writings about David and Jonathan, or just read 1 Samuel, which I had never really done, there is no way you can read that story and walk away and not at least be suspicious that something is happening here. And again, the rabbis, I quote the Talmud extensively in those chapters. This is something that has like a 3,500-year legacy of people speculating about what's going on with these characters. But to answer your question, the story that actually was most eye-opening and healing for me was the story of Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Because if you're in the tradition of more progressive or queer scholarship, you've probably heard that the word for garment that's used in that passage is kenet pasim in Hebrew. And the only other time it's used in the Hebrew Bible is to describe Tamar's dress, a woman's article of clothing. And so the rabbis have speculated for 3,500 years that Joseph was wearing a woman's garment. That's interesting, and I think that's beautifully affirming for our trans and non-binary siblings, but I actually think the more powerful story is about Joseph's father. Because what you have in this story is a father who sees their beloved child not fitting in. And yet, instead of forcing Joseph to be like his brothers, to fit into their culture and their religion, Joseph's father buys him a woman's garment, gives it to him, delights in him. The rabbinic writings say Joseph pranced around in the fields wearing this dress of many colors. It's a very queer understanding of what was happening. And if you know the story, Joseph is bullied relentlessly. His brothers try to kill him. They try to exile him. Clearly, there are undertones of what we would see as transphobia in the text. But the persistent thing in that story is the love and support of Joseph's father. And after this lifetime of supporting this son that was an outcast from their religion and society, Joseph ends up going on to becoming a great leader in Israel. And I thought, as I was writing that chapter, how healing and informative this would be to so many of the parents in our congregations of LGBT youth who come to us and say, what do I do? I have a queer child. I don't want them to get bullied. I'm worried about their safety. I don't know how to reconcile this with my faith. Yet our tradition for 3,500 years has had this story, calling parents and all of us to a persistent love of the one who stands out and is different. And as I've gotten to share that on this tour, I've had so many conversations with parents who have just found that healing and instructive. And it makes me I hope the book provokes those who read it to think about how we tell these stories in Sunday school and how we preach about them in the pulpit. Everything doesn't need to be about LGBT things, but there are a lot of LGBT things in the text. And I think if we can highlight them, we can undo so much of the harm that the church continues to perpetuate by misusing the stories in Scripture as a weapon against the queer community.
When you think about your own sense of queer identity, and some of your favorite scriptures and some of the moments in your life of faith, are there times or places where you've found them most aligned or most connected?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing being a queer Christian, and it's not an easy thing being a queer Christian pastor who's single either, I'll tell you that. Because, I mean, and I write about this pretty candidly in the book, like, these identities come into clash all the time. Try dating in New York City as a queer Christian pastor, and people are like, what in the heck is wrong with you? What is this? Folks are convinced I'm undercover from a conservative church trying to infiltrate the gay club. But to be honest, it is actually outside of the church that my identities have had the most space to flourish. Because on the other side of the skepticism and sometimes rejection from the LGBT community, who rightly should be suspicious of religious people showing up in our safe spaces, what I've also found is that the queer community in general, outside of the church, most of us have a story of religious trauma, and most of us have a deep, abiding spiritual life. Pew Research did a poll a few years ago that showed that every demographic in our country was declining in affiliation with religion. But the one demographic that was consistently identifying more and more year after year with religion, not with spirituality, was the queer community. There's a deep hunger, and there's a deep desire for these conversations. And I've experienced healing and the power and presence of God more in a queer nightclub in Name the City with people who feel free to show up and be themselves and share their stories and lives than I often have in the pew at a church. And this is the thing I was saying at the very opening, is I do think there are so many communities and spaces outside and on the edges of the institutions where we might not think to look for them, where people are doing really innovative and amazing spiritual work within the queer community. And again, I think so many of the organizations that I got to meet tonight that are here, and I hope you stop by and see them afterwards, are examples of people that are connected to institutions and working with institutions, but are also creating new things, generating new spaces. And for me, that is what's most exciting and where I feel most called in this moment. I will always have my foot as a pastor in the institution of the church, and again, love the church. And I'll talk more about why the church is so important later on tonight. And the Spirit has never been confined to four walls. St. Stephen writes in the book of Acts, God does not dwell in temples made by human hands. We need to be looking for God on the outskirts, in the unlikely places. And I think many of us would be surprised at how much spiritual renewal and revival is happening out in the world that doesn't look like a typical Christian church, but looks a lot like the movement Jesus began.
You mentioned, some of the texts that you have learned to look at anew and have a different perspective than you did previously through writing this book. How has writing the book and the process of writing it sort of influenced your own beliefs and your own personal theology?
Yeah, I mean, Joan, I always mess up her last name, Didion, is that how you say it? Yeah. She has this great quote. She says, I don't write what I think, I write to know what I think. And part of why I've written so many books is not because I have some ego project, although I probably did in my early 20s, but it's because writing is how I come to understand what I actually believe. And again, writing this book, I started off thinking this is just going to be another, you can be gay and Christian, here are defanging the clobber passages, go be a part of the church. And what this book became for me was this understanding of God that is growing increasingly expansive, an understanding of what Jesus was up to in the world that speaks directly to our cultural moments. You don't need me to say this. I know you preach this on Sundays. I know this church stands for this. But the gospel was made for a moment like this. The gospel emerged from a moment like the one we find ourselves in. And the more I got to work that out in this text and realize how subversive and radical and prophetic our tradition is, it actually made me more Christian than when I began. Because I've also been on, I mean, don't raise your hand, but many of us, I'm sure, over the past 10 years have had the real existential question of why am I still a part of this? As we've seen Christianity degraded in the way that it has been so thoroughly. And yet, when you get to wrestle with that old book, the Bible, as good and bad as it is, and you get to see the really subversive kernels within it, when you realize that the Bible was written by oppressed people longing for oppression, and has only been weaponized and taken by the powerful and privileged in our society, but it's never belonged to them, and it actually speaks against them from Genesis to Revelation. Like, that's pretty darn cool. There's something there for us. And so, yeah, by the end of this book, I was more Christian than I was when I began it. And again, I think this call to queerness is just the new way that I engage with my own relationship with God and my faith in general.
Since this book came out in end of May,
Yep.
is that right? And you have started hearing from people and meeting people who've read it, what are some of the things you've heard that have either been moving, or I'm also curious what's been surprising you didn't expect to hear from people?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, I'll subvert the question a little bit and say one of the things that has been most encouraging is not responses to the text of the book itself, but this. My first week of tour, I was in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Georgia. Everybody in New York City said, Brandon, be careful. You're going to those red states. It's going to be dangerous. And then I found rooms like this, packed with diverse people in the most unlikely of places, gathering to stand for a more inclusive and just Christianity, gathering to understand the resistance that our faith calls us to. And I've seen that in virtually, this is stop 23 on the tour, and I've seen it in every corner of this country. Resistance is building. Hope is there. People are doing the good work. Hearing what you said at the beginning, I'm so grateful that you talked about what this church is up to, because that's the kind of local work that actually transforms the world. In this moment, I know we're all overwhelmed by the CNN headlines and asking, what do we do to save our country and our world in this moment? The answer has never been that it's up to us to save our country and world. The answer is, you've been placed here in Fort Worth, in this neighborhood, to do the good work here and bring redemption here. And it's happening in each city across our country, in each town across our country. So all of that's just to say I'm more hopeful because of this tour, because I'm seeing what I don't get to see from my nice liberal bubble in New York City. And the other side is, I think the surprising on the more negative side is that there's been a division that has started within the broader LGBT Christian community in the past couple of years between those who consider themselves affirming Christians and those who adopt the label of queer Christian. And it's kind of what I talked about at the beginning. The affirming Christian movement believes that the only goal is to reinterpret the Bible so that we can fit into the traditional Christian church. And there's been a few people very publicly who have come out and said, people doing queer theology are dangerous to the movement. You're proving to all the conservatives that we're just on a slippery slope, that this is about deconstructing more than just sexuality and gender in the Bible, it's about everything. To which I say, yes, exactly. That is what we're up to. And so I've been a little disheartened in some of the conversations because there's a lot of pushback against rethinking sexual ethics, towards rethinking ethics in general, towards rethinking how we view the Bible. But again, I've been so encouraged by communities like this one where people are engaging in this work and that it's moving from the halls of the seminary to the pews in the church. And people are doing the really robust theological work that's necessary to, I think, reclaim Christianity, which has been thoroughly stolen from its radical core. So, yeah.
Very good. I'm curious, as you've kind of been to all these different places and you've seen a lot of those hopeful things in places you may not expect.
Yep.
What are you seeing or hearing from people that kind of lead you to understand what are the biggest obstacles to inclusion or to churches becoming more inclusive?
Yeah, those are two important questions. One on the individual, you all will know this. The number one thing I hear at every event is, I have family, I have friends that are non-affirming, what do I do? And many people want to know the arguments. How do I sit down at the Thanksgiving table in November and debate with my grandma about what the Bible says? I've been able to share this learned wisdom. I spent the past 10 years debating hundreds of conservative Christians. 10 years hindsight, let me tell you, all of it was a waste of time, a waste of energy. I've never seen one person change their heart or mind because of a good argument presented in a debate. And a few years ago, I was a part of a study at Auburn Seminary, and if you're interested, you can look it up online. It's called Our Mind Was Changed. And we studied a couple thousand white evangelicals and a couple thousand black conservative Christians, how to transform their hearts and minds on the topic of LGBT inclusion. And you all already know this answer intuitively. The results found that personal relationship and story was the only way that we were able to transform people's hearts and minds. And that's a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, to the LGBT person who has a non-affirming family, for instance, it means that the only way that that family is likely going to change their mind is by seeing them live out a whole and abundant life. But also, it's very hard to ask some folks to stay in relationship with people that are persistently toxic. And so it's not all, I don't believe it's the calling of anyone or all of us to be in relationship with people that we constantly have to defend ourselves and our existence to. But it is important for our allies and for the queer people who have been able to do the work to deconstruct, reconstruct, heal from trauma, to reach out, share our stories, do life with people who disagree, because that's the only way we can change hearts and minds. On the church side, I think it's pretty obvious that becoming a progressive, inclusive church is not a great church growth strategy. And I wrote about this in my book, True Inclusion, a few years ago. If we want this to become a mega church, preach hell every Sunday, become non-affirming, and people will show up. Because there's deep psychology rooted in the theology of traditional conservative Christianity that touches at a human level. We want certainty, we want to feel guilty, and we want to feel that we can be healed of guilt through believing the right things, through something easy. Like, there are so many psychological layers to why people resonate with more traditional conservative theology. And a lot of churches are really afraid. I mean, 8 years ago, I worked with 3 mega churches across the country. All 3 of them became fully affirming. And Time Magazine did a profile on them all, and every single one of them lost 50% of their members in 6 months. One of them shut down completely. One of them was a 2,000 member church, is now a 200 member church. It's not a growth strategy. But that is also an invitation for us as progressive Christians to rethink what the church is supposed to be. Maybe it's not about having full sanctuaries and butts in the pews on Sunday morning. Maybe it's about, again, doing what you're doing, being a witness that is bringing the community in to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God, being on mission as disciples of Jesus in the world, and reframing this whole church growth conversation. Like, if you're going to be inclusive, your church isn't going to grow rapidly, and it will also grow rapidly in the non-traditional ways. You have people coming on this campus every week to do justice ministries. They might not show up on Sunday mornings, but who cares? Is the purpose to do a worship service? Is that why we're Christians? No. The purpose is to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. So I'm rambling, but thank you.
No, you're doing great. You reminded me, and I had not made this connection, that when you read about the radically inclusive early church that you see in Acts and in the epistles, they were small communities.
Yeah.
There were lots of small communities. You didn't find the large cathedral communities until Christianity became the religion of empire.
Come on.
In which case, much of that was subverted and used for empire. So,
and there's a footnote in the book. I'll tell you this if you're interested. There are 2 books Bart Ehrman wrote a book called Lost Christianities, and a guy named David Litwa wrote a book called Found Christianities. And they're both analysis of the early Christian movements that were killed, literally, by the Roman Empire. And it's so fascinating to read how radical, and a lot like our communities, so much of these 2,000-year-old Christian traditions were, but had to be stamped out because it was a threat to the imperialization of Christianity. And so if you want to be encouraged about what you're doing in small communities of faith and what they can accomplish, I really recommend doing a nerdy deep dive into what happened to all of those communities that originated with the apostles and got lost 500 years later when the emperor decided to co-opt the Jesus movement for power and privilege.
I'm curious, for those of us here who are straight, cisgender, what are some things that you wish people who wanted to be allies knew, or things that maybe are not intuitive that we should know?
Yeah. I mean, I'm really encouraged, by and large, at the state of allyship in progressive Christianity today. People are going through O&A processes. People are coming to events like this. People are reading books and learning. And I think that's step one of good allyship on any issue. But there's a few pieces of advice that I give, especially in communities. One is there's an impulse in allies to be a voice for the voiceless. And there's a space for that, to speak up on behalf of and stand online for people that are being targeted and oppressed in your community. But what I found in organizing work is that we're in a moment where it's time to give the voiceless back their voice. Meaning, many marginalized communities want to speak for themselves and can only speak accurately about their experience of the world for themselves. And again, for an institution of a church, I talk with my church board about this all the time. The question is not how do we get them to come into our church, but how do we offer what we have to them to use to organize, to build resistance, to support one another? How do we make sure that our pulpit is occupied by people whose perspectives we're not otherwise going to hear? How can we give people the opportunity to have a voice, to use our resources? And again, I think a lot of churches are doing this well, and more are doing it. But it's really important to do the outward displays of inclusion. Pride flags are great. Showing up at the Pride festivals and parades are really important. And true inclusion demands that we actually put our resources, our energy, our community where our values are. And so I think that's the biggest thing that I've been saying to every community, because I know it's hard. I've pastored churches, and even largely queer churches have a hard time saying we're going to give up our resources to help those in our community thrive and organize, because so many of our churches are just trying to survive these days. But again, it's a reframing of what we're doing. It's a reframing of what allyship is. It's asking individually, how do we open up our home? How do we open up the resources we have to help those neighbors around us that are being targeted by ICE right now, or name the issue? There are a plethora of opportunities, and it's less about the performative stuff. It's less about talking about our values and why we stand up for people, and more about giving people the resources to stand up for themselves and know that we will be there to support them. Yeah.
One of the things you and I were talking about beforehand was what it is like to be a mainline church that has always sort of not necessarily been as inclusive as we want to be, but has never been evangelical, fundamentalist. And that's how I grew up with a female pastor in a disciple church, was not taught inclusion, but was not taught to exclude.
Sure.
So it's not a thing to unlearn. And so I find that I have a hard time relating to people who grew up in evangelical or fundamentalist, or as Katie Hayes says, fundagelical settings. And I would love to know, for those of us from mainline backgrounds or who've always been in mainline churches, what are some things for us to know or understand to help us welcome and include the ex-evangelicals who are finding their way into our congregations?
Yeah, I love that. And I'm going to, again, not answer the question at first and then get to an answer. Because there are two things I want to say here. One, I mean, I was a disciples pastor for almost 5 years. And I agree, there are rumblings in the Disciples of Christ about us being the best kept secret in mainline Christianity. And I think that's true of the United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, all of our mainline churches have this incredible legacy of being on the front lines of almost every major social reform movement in American history. And yet no one knows about it. I say this in the opening chapter of the book. Every major mainline denomination in this country is fully affirming of LGBT people at the denominational level, at least. That is a majority of Christians in this country numerically. And yet you walk out to the local LGBT bar or the Pride Parade and ask the average person, what do they think of Christianity? It's not that the majority of Christians in this country are LGBT inclusive. It's exactly the opposite. And so I've been harping on this for a few years. I don't have good answers, but I do think we progressive Christians, we mainline Christians, have to get our marketing game together. The evangelicals have been doing it really well for 50 plus years, and we are 50 years behind. But we have the radical subversive gospel. We have the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. and many in the suffragette movement. And in New York City during the Stonewall riot period, the gay rights movement was founded in mainline church basements throughout the West Village. Nobody knows that story. We've got to be telling it. We've got to be putting it out into the world. People need to know that on every corner, in every city in this country, there are churches like this, from Fort Worth, Texas to San Francisco, California. So market, market, market. I also think individual progressive Christians and progressive people in general need to stop being afraid of religion. So many of us are afraid to talk about our faith because we're afraid people are going to hear us and say, oh, you're one of them. And then you have a 10-minute conversation explaining how you're not that kind of Christian. We've got to get over that. We need to be able to speak about our politics with faith language. We need to be able to speak about our social perspectives with faith language. This means when you're posting that comment on Facebook, and I know you will, to that crazy person who said something far right on your timeline, use Jesus language. Let people know that you are a progressive person of faith. That's how we're going to change the narrative. The problem is, so many of us are just so afraid of the baggage that comes with Christianity. And it's why I chose the subtitle of the book, Reclaiming the Bible, Reclaiming Our Faith, Reclaiming Our Place at the Table. That's the call for progressives in this moment. Now, for the ex-evangelical question, we could be here for a couple days. I think the biggest thing to remember about the ex-evangelical community that enters into our churches, one, they're not going to like the style most of the time. The evangelical worship style, no matter how evangelical we try to be as progressives, we're just not going to be it. And that's okay. So a lot of ex-evangelicals are going to feel some kind of way when they walk into a mainline church and experience a mainline worship service, and they might not want to come to a Sunday morning service. Also, almost all ex-evangelicals have a weight of religious trauma on them that our pastors and our communities need to be willing to work with. I talk about in True Inclusion, the revolving door policy. A lot of ex-evangelicals will come into a mainline church, be amazed that something like this exists, stay for 6 months or a year, and then recognize this isn't for me and go on and continue their spiritual journey in some other way. And we have to be willing to facilitate that and count that as a win, that we helped people heal of their religious trauma, even if they don't end up staying in our religious tradition. And I do think that's rough for those who grew up mainline because you rightfully love the tradition, right? I'm an evangelical megachurch kid, and every Sunday we have the most traditional Reformed service you could ever imagine at Sunnyside Reformed Church in New York. And it's not my tradition, and I'm not jazzed about all of it, but I see for the people who it resonates with, it's really important. And for those who stop in just to see that there is an inclusive church and that it can happen, it's also really healing. And I've had to help my community think about what our purpose is. And again, it goes back to it's not the butts in the pews on Sunday morning. It's are we helping people heal, reconcile with God, reconcile with their faith? And if that means they go to meditation classes and yoga on Sunday morning instead of church, that's a win for us. we've done the work of the gospel. So, yeah.
One of the things I'm curious to hear your take on this aspect of it. I had a colleague at a previous congregation who had grown up Baptist, and she told the rest of us on staff that one of the things we just can't seem to understand is that in what she grew up in and what resonates with her, it was always talked a lot about having Jesus in your heart. And she's never heard anybody in that congregation we were serving say anything like that. Because it is a very head approach to faith. And that we have a hard time getting into our heart. Have you had any experience with that or any insight that might be helpful on that?
Yeah, I would say two things. One, I think mainline churches would do well to really lean into the contemplative tradition of our faith, because it's not the answer for everyone, but a lot of folks that come from a charismatic tradition will resonate with a contemplative tradition because it's getting into the same heart, emotion, embodied spirituality that they were experiencing as Pentecostals or charismatics. But the other thing is, I again do think that we as mainline people need to have some serious thoughts and wrestling with the idea of the Holy Spirit and what that means. And I'm not an expert on this, and I'm as mainline as they come these days. And there is something really profound about this experience of the Holy Spirit that has been in our tradition for, again, almost 4,000 years. People encountering God in a visceral and emotive way. And we need to not be afraid to experiment with that. It might be scary, it might feel weird, but like mainline churches, I did this with my staff at Mission Gathering in San Diego. We did field trips to churches. In the summer, we took a couple Sundays off, and I would literally take my staff to the Anglican Charismatic Church down the road, which had terrible theology, but goodness, to get to see a different way of spirituality, and then to come back and think, is there a way that we can bring our progressive theology and values and a deep, robust, experiential worship together? And there are churches that do it really well. Again, it's not for every church. I think preserving our traditions is also a beautiful thing, and it resonates with a lot of people. But again, if we're trying to reach the unchurched and the ex-evangelical, head faith is not going to do it. There has to be a heart connection. There has to be a body connection. And we see this across the board in emerging spiritualities. This might be a little off the deep end here, but like there's a whole movement of folks coming from progressive Christianity talking about psychedelics and things like that as a path to really embodied spirituality, because we have a really hard time getting it from our head to our bodies and our hearts. I'm not saying take your church on a mushroom trip, but
we do not yet have a ayahuasca ministry or anything.
When you do, let me know, though. But all of that is to say, these are conversations that are happening in the Richard Rohr spaces, in the Rob Bell spaces, and these are people having the conversations. And I think we would do well to listen and, again, be willing to queer our faith a little bit, not be afraid to cross some traditional boundaries. Again, maybe not with drugs, but with the way we do worship or the way we have contemplative prayer or meditation in service. And I think that might help a lot more people feel connected and drawn to what we're doing in progressive spaces.
Very good.
Yeah.
We are about to Q&A time. I was just going to see, before we move on to that, are there any final things you and I didn't cover that you want to make sure to say?
I think you hit it all. It was really great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good. Sure. All right. Well, Ryan, I think you're going to grab the handheld mic and bring that around to anybody who has a question. So what questions do you have? And if you have a question you'd like to ask Brandon, if you just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
So this might be, as a Jewish person, this might be a question everybody else in the room knows the answer to, because it seems really fundamental. Yeah. So if you want to answer later, just tell me. I don't want to waste their time. I'll tell you later. But the way you've described Jesus and the philosophies of Jesus, that's how I understood Jesus, mostly from musicals and movies. But he's so nice, and he loves everybody, and he's so open. How do all these, and I've had to deal with them sometimes in answer, all three kids, all my kids are queer, and my wife's an activist. And when I talk to a Christian fundamentalist, I want to ask that question. How do you justify feeling that Jesus would think any of what you're doing is right? And maybe that's obvious, but how did that what do they say? How can they defend that Jesus would be so exclusionary and dismissive and cruel?
Yeah, thank you. Do you all mind if I nerd out for a second? Many of you will know this, but this is one of my favorite conversations. Many of you can probably hear it in the answers I've given so far. I do think all of us would benefit as progressive Christians spending time in Jewish communities, because that is what transformed my faith most recently in my PhD studies, was learning Second Temple Judaism, first century Judaism of Jesus, and recognizing how foreign Christianity is, how so much of what we just accept as this is what Christianity is, Jesus, Paul, the apostles would never recognize. And there's a lot of reasons why there are these two different visions of Jesus, and some of them go back very early to the apostolic times, right? Jesus comes as this radical socio-political prophet in the Jewish movement of the first century, trying to lead a group of people against Rome and against the establishment of religion that had gotten in bed with Rome in a particular area of Judea at that time, and was pretty successful at doing it. And then what ended up happening, and you see this in the New Testament, many of you will be familiar with, you have the Jesus of the Gospels, who's this radical social prophet. Then you have Jesus of the book of Revelation, who is on a white horse with a sword, coming to wage war on anyone who doesn't believe in his gospel and vanquish the enemies. And it's a very different image of Jesus, but only about 100 or so years after Jesus was on earth. How does that happen? I think what we see in early Christianity is that the early Jesus movement didn't understand the subversive means that Jesus was trying to undermine the empire with. He wasn't trying to wage a war on the empire. He was trying to create radical communities where eventually most people in the empire would be a part of these radical communities, and that would overturn Caesar's power. But immediately the empire comes down with its full force on the Jesus movement. Christians are now being killed and persecuted. They're being rejected from the Jewish community because they started to worship Jesus as God, which is blasphemy in the Jewish tradition. And so you have this early marginalized group that begins longing, like in the Hebrew Bible you see, for liberation. And what the book of Revelation represents is an early Christian desire for God to come and vanquish their enemies and set them free and overturn the empire in the way that Jesus didn't when he was on earth. And so you begin having these two versions of Jesus at the very beginning, and they're both very understandable, right? But then you have the empire come along 500 years later, and they don't like the Jesus of the Gospels who was resistant to empire, and they start preaching this Jesus coming on a white horse, who in Revelation is actually coming to destroy the empire, but you can rethink that text and make it, he's coming to destroy the heretics, which is what most evangelicals teach today. It's us that are the ones that are left behind in the rapture to face the judgment of God because we don't believe their theology. And so from the Constantinian period, about 500 years into Christianity onward, you have this version of Jesus, a mighty warrior, who's more concerned about your theology and your adherence to the tradition than he is about your justice and subversion of imperial forces. And that just keeps growing in power. And what we have today is the religious right who primarily preaches Jesus of Revelation, not Jesus of the Gospels. And that's sexy to a lot of people, because Christians have been, in our modern world, as insane as it sounds to us, have a persecution complex. They believe that the world is coming against them and that they are the targets of the devil's agenda in the world. And so they have started to take on the posture of the actual early Christians who are being actually killed by the empire, and they're longing for their fiery Jesus to come and destroy all of us. You understand why people are drawn to that, but it's so divorced from the Jesus of history, the Jesus we find in our Gospels, the Jesus that we preach in progressive Christian churches. And the last thing, I think this also comes down to progressive Christians not being as loud and as public and as savvy as the religious right has been. They have co-opted Christianity. This moment, in particular, the Project 2025 moment, they've been planning it for 50 years. We have documentary evidence of the meetings between the Republican National Convention and the moral majority of Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson back in the 1950s and 60s. They planned for this to happen and were persistent. The question would be, can we progressives, maybe not to gain political power, but can we get ourselves organized in the way that the religious right has? Can we tell our message, which is truly good news of great joy for all people, as effectively as religious right has? I believe we can. I don't know how, but I think we can, and I think we have to. So, thank you.
I would just add, there were 2 different times I said this over the course of our denomination's General Assembly last few days, is there are few things more valuable than an organized progressive.
Yes, exactly.
Which are not always, that's not the natural state of many people in the progressive movement.
I think there are 3 organized progressives in the world, so we need to get more of them.
All right. Who else has a question for Brandon?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, wait for the mic. Hold on. We got you.
Hello, thank you so much. I've just been doing some reading about medieval history, and particularly about the life of Hildegard von Bingen, 11th century, 12th century. And one of the things that this text was speaking of was the common and beautiful relationships of nuns living together, having these lovely same-sex relationships for years and years, and that it was common knowledge even amongst those in power in the Catholic Church, and that a lot of it is tied to the nuns' female nature, and that they didn't have souls, and so therefore they could not possibly be sinning because they did not have their own souls to sin with. But we'll put that aside. But I found it to be so beautiful to read stories, ancient stories of women loving women and men loving men in the context of the church. And I wondered if that's something you've spent any time studying and how that's affected you in your writing.
Thank you so much for that. The hardest chapter I wrote in this book, and it's the one that I'm most proud of, is the chapter on sexual ethics. Because I take it seriously, and I didn't just want to write liberally for the sake of it. I want it to be a pastor to people and help people think through this. And of course, I do not have a traditional Christian sexual ethic. I make a case, I think it's a clear biblical case, that the Bible doesn't condemn premarital sex once from Genesis to Revelation, that the Bible does not have a consistent sexual ethic anywhere. The Bible does not define marriage once. None of that exists in our text. And I also quote Walter Wink, among some other people, who says, there has never been a consistent Christian sexual ethic. And I took a wonderful class in my PhD seminar a couple years ago on the history of sexual ethics in Christianity, and you find exactly that. In virtually every century, the official Christian sexual ethic has been vastly different. There were hundreds of years during the medieval period where prostitution was encouraged, that men who could not control their lust were encouraged by the church, go have sex with prostitutes so you can keep your marriage pure. You're exactly right. In both monasteries and in, nunnery is not the right word, what is the word? Convents. Nunneries though, fun.
Shakespeare called them nunneries.
Exactly, you're right. In those settings, yes. It was known by the church, and it is certainly known by the Vatican today, that many of the people in religious life are actually queer people. And this is in Protestant circles too. If you look at the average Protestant seminary, mainline seminary today, 95% of the folks are queer. So the future of the church is going to be queer, just so you know. And it's actually not a new thing. Queer people have been drawn to ministry throughout the ages for a variety of reasons. I think we can talk about dispositions and personalities that make folks more conditioned for ministry. I think there's some cases to be made there. But there's been large periods of church history where queer priests and queer nuns were allowed to exist, and it wasn't a problem because they justified it in strange ways, like women don't have souls, and that it's not a sin for two men because of reproductive questions, and like wild stuff when you read Christian sexual ethics throughout the history. But all of that simply to say, the church has never been consistent on this, and it's been a myth that we've been teaching in conservative churches, that there is a biblical sexual ethic that we need to stick to and get back to. It's not in the pages of the Bible. There's wild, crazy stuff happening in the pages of the Bible. The Song of Solomon, most scholars know, is an entire book of two people having premarital sex that is celebrated in the Jewish tradition, and yet Jewish kids were not allowed to read it as young people because it was understood to be erotica for many periods of time. That's in our Bible, friends. So all of that just to say yes and amen. And I hope that some of the footnotes in the book, if you're interested in this, like reading just a brief book about Christian sexual ethics through history. There's a great book called Good Christian Sex. Came out a few years ago. I think Lauren Winner wrote it, or I forget the name of the author. But it does a quick deep dive on a popular level of the crazy things we've believed as Christians about sex. And it helps remove a lot of the shame that so many of us feel because you recognize it's a lie. You've been told a lie about what God requires of you. So, thank you.
All right, who else has a question?
My name is Randy, and my pronouns are he, him, his. And I have a trans son, and that's just to identify a little bit with some of you. But my question has to do with Paul, the Apostle Paul, because I am one of those ex-evangelicals. So the problem of Paul has always been talked about. Is Paul more queer than we give him credit for, would you say? Or is he as bigoted as we say he is concerning some of the social issues? How do you view Paul?
Yeah, thank you for that. I'll give a shout out to our mutual friend, Eric Smith wrote a great book called Paul the Progressive, ? And it's a great book that dives into all of Paul's problematic passages. I have a love-hate relationship with Paul, and I think we all probably should. Paul was very progressive for his time in many ways. And if you actually read Paul's theology in the context of first century Judaism, Paul's a universalist. Paul is working to abolish slavery, though he doesn't get there. He's working to help continue Jesus' movement to elevate women, but he doesn't get there. But on the issue of sexuality, while I make the case in the book that I don't think Paul was thinking about queer people when he wrote Romans 1 or 1 Corinthians, I also don't think Paul, if he showed up in our church today, would be affirming of LGBT people. And that's because Paul's a man of his time. The first century Judaism was deeply patriarchal. I explore this in the Old Testament passages of the ways that the ancients viewed gender and sex are so different. And we would consider, almost anyone would consider them ghastly. Again, men were not allowed to have sex with one another because the primary fear was that it made one of the men like a woman. That's the primary fear operating under the prohibitions of Scripture, which shows the deep misogyny that has run through our tradition from the very beginning. When it comes to gender issues, Paul does have a divine ordering of the world where he believes that women are inferior, men are superior, and that there is an ordering to the church and the world. I don't think Jesus held precisely Paul's rigid perspective, but Jesus certainly also had, this is what Jesus would have been taught. All of that to say, Paul is a complicated figure, and I want to invite us as progressive, honest arbiters of biblical text to have the freedom to say Paul is wrong. Paul does not have to have authority for us in everything Paul writes. Paul is one Christian teacher who just happened really by a fluke of history to end up writing what we now call the New Testament. Paul didn't know that's what he was doing. And half of the New Testament letters attributed to Paul are not written by Paul. So it's hard to say Paul was good or bad because we don't know mostly when Paul is actually talking. But I do think Paul's a great example for all of us of somebody who's trying to wrestle with his culture, his religion, and his worldview, and this radical new message of Jesus and trying to figure out what to do with it all. Sometimes he gets it right, sometimes he gets it wrong. By and large, on issues of sex, Paul gets a lot of stuff wrong. But again, it's because he's operating from a patriarchal worldview that even the most conservative Christian rejects today. So wrestle with him. And in my book, I wrote a book called Filled to be Emptied. If you're really interested, there's a great conspiracy theory about Paul being this interloper who was actually trying to subvert the radical nature of the Jesus movement. And it is interesting how Paul moves the Jesus movement from this social vision that Jesus has to a theological vision, which then kind of undermines the social action Jesus was about. And so there's some unique scholarship around that if you're interested, and I can share it with you later if you want to know more, but thank you for that.
Anyone else have a question? Okay. Well, Brandon, thank you for
Thank you
coming
all.
and sharing your time with us.
Thanks for allowing me to rant on 15 different topics tonight. I really appreciate it. So good.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So here in just a few minutes, Brandon is going to do a book signing in our fellowship hall, just through the foyer and down the hall. And we do have copies of his book available for sale for $30. That is the same price you would pay if you ordered from a huge website place that I'm not going to say the name of. So you're getting a deal here by buying it on site.
Yes.
And those are provided by Monkey and Dog Books, our local bookseller. So I wanted to be sure to give them a plug because they were the ones who ordered a case of books for us and made them available so that we have them here at the event. In addition to that, we have some refreshments, so feel free to take advantage of those. And as mentioned earlier, we have some great organizations there that we hope that you'll take some time to visit with. And as I mentioned them earlier, even if it's not something that is necessarily helpful to you right at this moment, it may be something that is helpful to someone you know or will be helpful to someone you will meet someday. And so knowing these organizations and their missions and maybe some of the events they have coming up is a really helpful thing. So I encourage you to take some time to do that. So I will see you there. And Brandon, thanks again.
Thank you all so much.